Hi, everyone. So we are going to be moving into Module 4, which is all about a recursive review, that iterative process, and interrogating and evaluating your design. So in this module, we are going to cover validity and how the idea of validity comes up throughout your design. We're going to talk about ethics and IRB, and then talk about how your design will show up in a proposal, and then, of course, our course culmination. So today is going to be lecture 13, Designing with Validity in Mind, all about how you can build trustworthiness, credibility, and resonance across your design. So over the course of these readings and this perusal, some of the things to focus on are being able to define and conceptualize what validity is, and as it relates to your work, how you are going to define it. Thinking about where and how validity fits within your research design process and where it will show up in your writing. Examine different types and dimensions of validity. Think about what the threats to validity are and what that means in qualitative research. And then finally, consider the methods and strategies that you can use and that you specifically will use in your design. So in terms of locating where design is, let's go back to Maxwell's interactive model of research design. So we've been talking about this all semester, how you have your research questions in the center, your top triangle, which is the conceptualizing with your goals, conceptual framework, research questions, and then the bottom triangle that builds out your actual design, which again interacts with the research questions to have your methods, and then of course validity. But as you can see, there is this dotted line here to your conceptual framework. Your goals, of course, are connected to the method, and validity is going to be located not as a tack on or at the end, but really throughout. So thinking about how you are going to talk about that, where and how. So when you think about validity, it's important to begin by thinking about your intention and what it is that you hope your research accomplishes and how you hope it impacts participants, the community. So here are some ideas, and if you have more, please put them in perusal. But maybe your goal is that your research is caring or thorough, helpful, fair, reliable, authentic, honest, respectful. So start thinking of these different adjectives that might describe what you hope your research is, and this will help set your foundation for what it is that you really value and how you can intentionally build in validity strategies that honor that perspective. So in qualitative research, just like in quantitative research, it's important to think about what does it mean for a study to be valid or trustworthy or thorough. So that's important to think about. So when we think about this idea of valid, there's so many different dimensions to this idea. And so I have them listed here, and you might have more to include in perusal as well. Some qualitative researchers talk about trustworthiness, some talk about reliability, others use validity, credibility, objectivity, dependability, transparency, transferability, triangulation, quality, rigor, authenticity, generalizability, crystallization, or honest. So oftentimes you will see multiple of these chosen because there are different definitions within these. These are all not perfectly synonymous. And so a researcher might have one element that they define as trustworthy and then have transparency demonstrated in other aspects. So here are some of the words to look for, and you might see different researchers use different definitions or are more resonant with different conceptions. So think about that and look at that in your own work as well, how you are going to talk about it. So in our readings that you're going to do in perusal, so we have Maxwell chapter 6, which is all about validity. He titled the chapter, How Might You Be Wrong? And so thinking about that, Marshall, we have an excerpt. She has both validity and ethics together. So we're going to read an excerpt here. And then I'm also including in this lecture, even though it's not assigned readings, some of the insights from Ravage, chapter 6, which is also about validity. And of course, you have access to that book as well if you're interested in taking a look. So thinking about, particularly from Maxwell and other authors as well, validity as an argument in your methods, in your writing, Your validity methods or your validity strategies are an argument that your interpretations are credible, showing this correlation between the conclusions that you've drawn about your data and the reality. And again, reality will be mitigated and outlined by your ontological positioning. But thinking about the relationship between that and how and to what extent they correlate and what you have done to demonstrate that you have thought deeply about this. When Ravitch talks about it, she talks about the value, the goal, and the process of validity running throughout the whole process. So thinking about the validity all the way from the beginning in the conceptualizing, the data collection, analysis, and writing phase, and how each of those phases are iterative and reflect the values and goals of the researcher, going back to the slide that I just showed about what some of the goals of your research might be. Marshall really centers in on this idea of trustworthiness that's grounded in ethical mindfulness. So, thinking about what are the dimensions and the differences between credible versus trustworthy, and how that might better reflect your epistemological framing or how you've done your design. But it's important to understand that no matter the particular method that you use in terms of what you are calling this construct of validity, it's not a checklist of methods that you can just tack on to the end or that you can check off and then therefore your study is valid. It's not really a stagnant yes or no, but again, an argument or a continuum. We often talk about it as validity evidence. What is the evidence that this construct is happening? How have you demonstrated this in your work and in your writing? So instead of being like a checklist or something that you can just check off and move on from, think of validity as an interactive process or an orientation that requires you to deeply consider the complexity of the context that you're studying and your role in interpreting that context. So in terms of thinking about validity as an ethical stance, this is so important, and I'm sure you'll have other insights to include in perusal as well, because the conclusions that you are drawing, the interpretations that you are drawing, and the writing that you are ranking has implications for, of course, the immediate participants in your study, but also the broader community. It could be policy, it could be intellectual knowledge, it could have implications for not your direct participants, but the greater population that you are writing about. So it is a big responsibility, which is why validity is so important. So I wanted to highlight a few notes from Marshall chapter 3 that you are going to be reading. I'm looking forward to hearing your comments as well, but these are some of my annotations. So she starts off, and just like I showed you on that diagram in the beginning, with identifying several adjectives that you can use to start to think about your work and what you hope that your work is. And then connecting that to your goals, your values, who you are. She has this quote here: think about what you believe in, what has credibility for you. And then thinking about, in our context, and of course, this book was written at the height of 2020, fake news, what convinces you? And so thinking about that and then building on that to make your writing convincing to others. And then it's really important when we're thinking about validity. Oftentimes, when we look at the continuum of qualitative research in terms of the paradigm, sometimes qualitative research tries to mimic or replicate or be analogous to quantitative research. And sometimes that's appropriate if you are in the post-positivistic or sometimes constructivist paradigm, but oftentimes it isn't analogous. And so being careful of your language there. For me, validity is a bit in the quantitative realm. So I'm using it as a broad term to encompass this idea of being credible or honorable or trustworthy. So I'm using that kind of as a catch-all, but being careful that you are not succumbing to the same validity that is used in quantitative research, but thinking about it differently, because in qualitative research, if you're coming from a constructivist orientation or a critical orientation or a post-structural orientation, you have a very different view about how knowledge is produced represented, and what knowledge claims are valid. And so therefore, when you're talking about validity, you will have a different conception of what makes those knowledge claims valid because you have a different orientation in terms of what they even are. So some of these other ideas that will come up in Marshall too have to do with ethics and how you as the researcher position yourself, how you interrogate your positioning, and how you are transparent in that. So in some paradigms, you might be positioned as having empathetic neutrality, sort of a more objectivist stance where you are hoping to suspend your assumptions, your experiences to really focus in on the participants. And in other paradigms, you might not claim to be neutral, and your interpretations are going to be very much enmeshed with your experiences and perspectives. So that's why it's so important to clearly state your paradigm and how you view knowledge, and also clearly state how you will go about collecting your data and analyzing and interpreting your data, because that in and of itself demonstrates reliability and trustworthiness because you are being transparent about how you're coming about it. So another quote that stood out to me is that you are complex, as is your intersectionality, all of the intersections of your identity, and all of those come into play. And especially at this point, they are fluid. And so keeping that and tracing that throughout your writing is really important. So there's so many different places where you can talk about validity. Oftentimes, this is a separate section in the methodology where you have in your chapter 3, you've written about your overall approach, you've written about your data collection methods, your data analysis methods, your sampling, all of those procedures. And you will also write about your methods to establish trustworthiness or validity or whatever you choose, whatever method you choose to go with and name in your work. So you will have a separate section about this. However, the idea of validity should not only be talked about there at the end, but it should be visible throughout your entire methodology chapter. So these are some notes on where it could show up in something like field notes during data collection. And then thinking about the project's final credibility and usefulness to others will be enhanced if future readers can find it in the research report. So a careful account of the sites and the sampling procedure, because again, that demonstrates trustworthiness and it makes your work more credible. So another reading that is recommended, not required, but recommended is crystallization. I know that you're all familiar with the idea of crystallization. I have included an excerpt from one of the original books about crystallization. So thinking about that as a construct, if you're choosing to use that, you definitely need to read that article and perhaps the whole book to think about how your knowledge claims can be more credible or more robust if you have this crystallized approach, not to have more confirming information, but rather to have deeper and from more angles, a more illustrative view of your topic, full and balanced representation. So again, crystallization is a metaphor to conceptualize what validity means. And in this method, there is a heavy emphasis on self-critique or self-reflexivity and the methods that you can do to establish it. So when we're talking about validity, of course, there are many different dimensions. We've been talking about different terms. I showed you so many. So I want to kind of trace through some of those and point you in some directions to further define each of these constructs to find ones that really resonate with your work and fit with the paradigm and the method that you have identified. So some canon authors, Lincoln and Gupta, they talk about credibility, transferability, dependability, and confirmability. So look out for these in the readings to think about what is similar about these, but specifically what each of these mean and how they are distinct from each other and how they might work together. Ravage gives us a few more. She talks about transaction validity, which has to do with accuracy through participant feedback. So, based on where you are on the continuum or in terms of paradigm, this might be of utmost importance to you in your study. Also, transformational validity, thinking about the emancipatory potential of research leading to change and how valid research is, or how effective or how transformational research is as a metric of quality. Maxwell also talks about some threats to validity, which I think is, again, very analogous to quantitative research. However, I think that this is a way that many people are familiar of. And even though I think that the language of it is oftentimes out of the scope of many of the qualitative paradigms, I do think that the ideas are helpful. So one thing that's important is to think about bias, and based on where you are in the paradigm, not that it's a bad thing, but thinking about how your preconceived notions shape what you choose to see and record. So it's not that your bias should not be included, but it's a matter of interrogating your bias and constantly going through that question, how might I be wrong about what I'm initially seeing? Reactivity. So this has to do with, in qualitative research, we're in the field, we are interacting with people and participants in their natural settings. And so thinking about how our presence influenced what participants shared or did not share. And again, the goal is not to eliminate these influences, but rather work them into our design through reflexivity. That's going to be a major theme in these readings, to consider how your identity, assumptions, and relationships shape your findings. So this is from Marshall, chapter 3, and how she conceptualizes the idea of validity, or what she calls trustworthiness, and the different dimensions that she thinks build it. So your relationships with your participants, ethics, and then your transparency. So this might resonate with you, or you might have your own graphic of the different dimensions that are coming together to build a trustworthy or credible or dependable study for you. So another key point from Marshall, and this also is in the chapter 1, defining crystallization. This came from that book, actually. So they've used that here. But when you're thinking about validity, I think this is like my third or fourth time saying this in this lecture. But again, just like every other component of your design, it is going to align with your paradigm. So on this chart that you will see in the chapter, she has an art impressionist paradigm, middle ground, which is like a constructivist paradigm, and then science or realist, which would be a post-positivist paradigm. And so I put the box here because many of us are coming to this work from a constructivist paradigm. And so here are some of the ideas that are important for validity here, or you might be looking in the art impressionist. So make sure you look out for that as well. So when you're thinking about validity or trustworthiness, there are many different strategies and methods that you can do to help you establish this in your study and also demonstrate it. So I'm going to go through quickly a few of these, and you will see more of them in the readings and read more about them, and you might have more to add. So the first one being prolonged engagement in the field, intensive involvement. And this can help you discover any discrepancies, test your interpretations. Also, this idea of thick, rich description can help you fully contextualize the findings and allow readers to have the full context, which helps with dependability and credibility, so they can fully understand the setting, participants, and processes. And this idea of transferability, for qualitative research to be transferable, it's important that readers are able to fully understand what your setting was to make meaningful adaptations for what their setting might be. Idea of triangulation or crystallization, whichever conception works, resonates with your work, using multiple methods, theories, perspectives to illuminate the issue. And it's meant to, of course, see the issue with nuance and complexity. This idea of participant validation might be called member checking, but checking for resonance, And I think this is critical, allowing for change, not only thinking about how you will do that, will you do that, but how will you demonstrate that this happened in your final report if this is a method that you use. Oh, okay, I have that twice. Okay, but next one, peer debriefing and dialogic engagement. Planning, this is so important. This is actually the mini memo for this class, but structured reflexivity. Planning in those sessions, how you will engage in reflexivity is so important to avoid unchecked biases. Searching for disconfirming evidence, actively looking for data that contradicts your initial interpretations. And then having audit trails and transparency enables others to see how your conclusions were reached. Okay, so in terms of credibility, here are some resources from Ravage, Chapter 6. If you're in the slides, this is a link to the book. So Ravage, of course, takes a bit of a more political stance to her iteration of qualitative design. So she really emphasizes the ethical and political considerations, and she frames it as criteria of soundness in demonstrating the validity or trustworthiness of quality of research. So here in this table, here are some methods or suggestions to demonstrate or to establish soundness in your research. This first one is about planning to use a critical friend, again, like that dialogic engagement, describing your community of practice, who you will collaborate with. This idea of building in time for cross-checking or participant review and searching for negative instances. Describing how analysis will draw on but not be limited to the previous literature. That's a lot of the work that we did in our last module. Showing examples of your descriptive and non-evaluative note-taking, maybe showing your memos, your researcher field notes, your transcription to show how you did that. Citing previous researchers who have written about bias, subjectivity, data quality to help support how you are coming at this. And of course, analytic memos describing how you will write it, and how you will use those as a reflexive tool. And then keeping ongoing records. Ravage has all of those different logs, like the researcher logs and ideas about how to keep your files organized, how to keep your notes organized, can be really important. And then she has the validity constructs with these different dimensions of qualitative research, and then some questions to consider. So as you are thinking about the divergences and convergences between these different constructs, these questions might help you as well. Credibility, transferability, dependability, confirmability. And again, if you're looking in her text, go to chapter 9 to find this table. Now, in terms of reflexivity, talked about how important that is. Reflexivity is so important because these are planned, intentional opportunities for you to think about how who you are shapes not only what you see, but how you interpret it, and being explicit about your standpoint and your positionality for yourself, for your participants, and for your readers. So when I'm talking about structured reflexivity, I'm talking about planned parts of your design, planning for those moments when you will engage in reflexivity. Those memos, discussions with a dialogic partner, or you might have other ideas, your video confessionals, however you are going to plan this in, but making sure that it's part of your design. Again, coming back to Maxwell, asking often, how might I be wrong? And this idea that trustworthiness depends on your ethics. And so how you relate and represent participants is another way to demonstrate validity. This idea of transparency, being honest, and clearing your methods and procedures is so important to demonstrate validity as well. So thinking about ethics and validity as being intertwined. And if you want to have credible research, you need to have an ethical stance that honors participant experiences. So when you are building trustworthiness, you need to have transparency, reflexivity, ethical practices, and those methods that allow you to have careful attention to how you might be wrong. And then coming back to this idea of validity as argument, validity is all about planning and carrying out a design that convinces yourself, participants, and your readers that your interpretations are credible, nuanced, response. I don't know what I meant there. Respectful of the people and context at the center of your study. Okay, so I wanted to call out a few of the readings. So this is one of the recommended readings. This is from Tracy's Big 8 criteria for excellent qualitative research. So she has these 8 conceptions of what makes it quality. So instead of thinking about validity or trustworthiness, talking about quality, a worthy topic, rich rigor, sincerity, credibility, resonance, a significant contribution to the field, ethical, meaningful coherence. So this article is really helpful. It's short, but it gives you a lot of different important questions to think about that really resonate with a lot of students. So I really encourage you to read this article and think about how your work is demonstrating quality by a lot of these things. And then this is from another one of our articles, is thinking about some of the different purposes of the strategies that are often used to demonstrate validity, such as thick description, personal essay, and then how this can show up in your writing. These are some suggestions from Ravitch during data collection, what you can do, methods that you can do to demonstrate validity. And then this is from Ravitch as well. This is all about aligning design with research questions. This is a chart that we started in module 1 when we were building our conceptual framework. So we started off with, what do I need to know? Your research question. Why do I need to know this? The goal. Then building on what kind of data will answer these questions. What will your analysis methods be? Your potential conclusions. And then here you have your alternative explanations, thinking about your threats to validity, and then your methods to investigate those alternative explanations. So this can be a helpful chart and a helpful way to think about the process. So here is another table from Ravitch, some methods to help you think about during data analysis. She calls this considerations for trying to resist interpretive authority. So how in your written report you can demonstrate validity through how you choose to share data and discuss your findings. So just a few things of note here as I move towards the end. Thinking about positionality and reflexivity as distinct yet related when it comes to research. So positionality, when in your work, you might establish your positionality by being transparent about your assumptions, biases, potential impacts on a specific research setting that's mediated by your identity. And then reflexivity, thinking of that as a praxis, an action, something that you are continuously engaging in, where you are recursively interrogating how your positionality impacts all elements of the process. So a sensibility. Not that your positionality is fixed, because of course we are all always growing and our viewpoints are always changing. So, but positionality is who we are at the moment, all the dimensions of our identity. But then reflexivity is, again, interrogating who we are as it relates to our research. And then identity is kind of undergirding all of this as well. So hopefully that was helpful to think about that. This is from Marshall. These are some reflexive screens that you can use when you are building in that structured reflexivity. These are some questions that you can build into your design to establish credibility and trustworthiness. When you're thinking about this and your reflexivity, thinking about where you want to position yourself on the continuum from extant to enacted or elicited, and what metaphors you would use and how you're going to position yourself in your research, and again, how you will check this with reflexivity. We talked about that. This is one of my favorite metaphors for reflexivity. So oftentimes we think about reflexivity as looking at yourself in the mirror, but that's more so your positionality. But this idea, and I do have the link to the site here if you want to read the full article, but Annette, she conceptualizes reflexivity as not looking at yourself in the mirror, but looking at yourself, looking at your reflection in the mirror. So this idea of not just analyzing yourself, but analyzing yourself recursively in relation to the object, context, and process of inquiry. It's more than just the reflection we get in a mirror. Rather, it's like trying to look at yourself looking in the mirror. So to help you think about that. So we also have, so these are the two recommended articles that I have. They are included in perusal. This one is the Big Tent Criteria for Excellent Qualitative Research. This is something great to cite in your work, in your chapter 3, when you're talking about demonstrating quality. Again, that idea of worthy topic, that idea of rigor. And then we also have crystallization, which is something else that you might be citing as well. And then here are the choice articles that you can choose from to read in perusal. And as far as your memo, it is going to be all about reflexivity and generating a list of opportunities for you to engage in structured reflexivity during your work. So I look forward to hearing your comments about validity and reading your memos and all of your comments. So I will talk to you soon.